it's like almost like an energy that's given off. It's like almost like an at peace, like just level type of energy that I feel priests have.
Maybe the peace is not the word that we should be using, like, because you're not, life is not peaceful, right? Like
No.
even from a spiritual point of view, it's a struggle and it's a battle. I think the difference is that if you have the tools to deal with the battle, like to fight it properly and effectively, or not. That's the I think that's the big between like the people who kind of exude or they give off a type of calmness even in the face of like adversity, as opposed to people who don't have those tools. Um, so it's not so much being at peace, but rather um, maybe being more peaceful. Like people ask me for, I'll give you an example, practical examples, because it's just easiest that way. So for example, I deal with a lot of death and sickness, right? Because that's the nature of my job, right? So a lot of times I'm spending a lot of time with people who are suffering in hospitals, on their deathbeds, in their homes, like, but usually when people are suffering, and so, when people say, "Oh, what did you do today, Father?" Right? It's like, well, I went to this one person, and he's like on his deathbed, he's about to pass away, and then I went to a hospital, and this other person's ready to die, and they're suffering, and then I went to see this, and they say, "Oh, like I don't know how you deal with that, and you're not upset or stressed all the time. Are you desensitized to it?" And so, and my at least I can only speak personally. I can't speak for other priests, but I'm not desensitized to it. I don't think I'm desensitized to it. But the way you handle those situations, like your outlook on life, is different. So, for example, like for me, I don't lose sleep over people who are in bad situations, not because I don't care, but because it's just like it's in the program, right? It's part of life, and I'm going to be there at some point, and there's there's suffering and there's death and there's also birth and joys, and it's all like you kind of look at life at a grander scheme, and because we as priests we see it more often than the average person, your perspective is different.
Yeah.
Like for the average layperson, you're dealing like with one of those at a time,
Mhm.
maybe two. So someone's gonna die in your family, it consumes the whole family. You're dealing with that, right? Or
Yeah.
someone's getting married, okay, people are into that, right? Or someone's
Yeah.
getting baptized, but the priest can see all that in one day
Right.
and multiple times a week.
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot of priests are struggling with things like depression and this. And so what are then some of the tools that help you and other people that others can relate to and use in their lives? Because a lot of people are going through this stuff, especially in a world today. So what are some of those tools and things that sort of keep you level and
So
calm?
yeah, so you know, you have to have you hear a lot of people, they talk about balance and work life balance and things like that. And that is really important, but it's more than that. Like, definitely um, a lot of people who are struggling, especially clergy, they don't have a balance, right? And what do I mean by that is that they give everything to the church in the sense that they will give themselves wholeheartedly to the ministry, but they don't keep anything back for their families, for their children, for themselves, right? To their detriment, many times. So, you know, uh, you're running around like doing 60-hour work weeks, and then meanwhile you've missed your children's soccer games, you've missed your children's pageants at school, you don't know who they are because you're missing bedtime with them, or you're missing dinner time, or you don't know who your wife is anymore because you haven't seen her because she's working and you're working, and there's no time. So of course this is a problem in a lot of professions, not just priesthood. But I find that in ministry, um, the reason why this happens, people think, well, it's because the priest is a good guy and he wants to help everybody. That's not the reason. The reason is ego.
Hmm.
So the ego is always the driving force, right? So, and why do I say that? It's like, you know, if we didn't have ego, then we would understand that God is not that what we do doesn't matter, but in the end, God is in control of everything, and there is a plan, and we can't save everybody. We don't save anybody. God saves people, right? Like the only thing that priests do is that I always say the priests facilitate the encounter with God,
Mhm.
right? Or really, that's what the priest should be doing. So the priest is not saving anyone. The priest, it's not his church, it's not his ministry, and they're not his people. They are God's people, and the priest is a functionary. The priest is like, he's put in a place to lead, and if he sucks or if he's no good or whatever, the church can take it away. And and if you understand that, then you understand that you can't save everyone. So if you think you can save everyone, that's when you burn out because you're running always. There's always somebody else hurt. There's always somebody else who's in trouble. There's always somebody who wants you, who needs something, right? If you don't learn how to say no sometimes because you get sick, um, understand your limitations, then you're gonna go in a downward spiral. So that's really, I think, the
That's
core
a
of it. You
yeah.
have to understand.
That's an interesting perspective. So when you say ego, do you see it as like the negative context of ego, where like the priest is like it feels like it's all about them and they want like the spotlight, or it's more like ego because like they genuinely want to help that individual and not think of it like it's God's people, or is it like
Um,
both? Or does that make
it's it,
sense?
it, it's ego. When I refer to ego in this sense, I mean the negative aspect,
Okay.
and it doesn't have to be all about the priest in the sense like I want to be popular or I want to whatever, but it is the sense that the priest has a God complex.
Mm-hmm.
So he thinks he's going to save. He thinks it's him doing it, and he's not.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because you're not. It's not your job to save people, right? And so it's still bad. And some of it is also popularity. It's like, well, if you're the priest that you don't want to upset anybody, and you want to be the popular guy, and you want to be liked by everybody, then that's gonna compromise your ministry because and I speak for myself. I'm not speaking about other priests. Like I speak about my own. I'm 14 years now priest, and I've gone through the phases. Right.
Yeah.
It took me a long time. Um, I would say it took me about a decade of doing the wrong thing. Like I worked hard. Okay, successful, whatever that means, as far as
Mhm.
in the parish and things like that. And but internally, I was doing the wrong things, right? Because I was running, and then you begin to sit back and you analyze, well, why am I doing? Am I doing it because I love my people? Of course, there's a part of that. But how much am I doing because of it feeds my own ego, my own pride? Like,
Yeah.
you know, do I need to say yes to everybody, or can I say no? I can't do this, or I don't have the capacity to do this, or I don't have the knowledge base to advise you on this, or there's somebody better than me, or I'm just too tired and I have to physically rest, um, even if that disappoints parishioners, right? So I learned that the hard way, getting to the point where I was, extremely overweight and I didn't have any time for myself and or my family and just feeling really down and burned out all the time, right? And I had to kind of like rejig my whole life and kind of find that balance. Now I feel like in the especially last 3 4 years, I'm in a much better position
Hmm.
where I don't feel bad about saying no to people.
Yeah.
Not from an egotistical, selfish point of view, but just from an understanding that this is my capacity, this is what I can do effectively, these are the things I can't do, and I can't be ashamed to say the things that I can't do, and I have to have that balance, right, with my family, my life, and my personal recreation and
Yeah. I think
fitness
that
and things like that, right?
I think that makes a lot of sense. So, because you said it, like, what obviously success is very subjective. So, what does success mean to you then as a priest?
Well, this is the thing, right? It's like that's a very complex question because um, it's like different priests see it differently, right? It's like, is a full church successful? Maybe. But what if that church is full of people who are there because they like the priest, not because they love Christ, right? And then
Yeah.
that priest leaves or he gets transferred and the church empties. Did the priest do his job? Not really,
No.
right? Because he created a cult of the personality.
Right.
And so it's like, what is success? I would say that if you can somehow effectively point people to Christ, and what does that mean? Like, if you can somehow inspire people to love the church more than they love you, or a specific aspect, like you know, then I think you've done your job. So what does that mean? It means that people should love their community. So let's say I leave. Let's say one day I get transferred, whatever, and I have to go somewhere else, right? If people stay connected to their home parish, regardless of what priest comes, and they continue to do the good work of, like, charity and philanthropy and supporting, then I think you've taught them the right thing. You've taught them humility and to be connected to a community and to sacrifice and to volunteer and to keep helping their local community, which is what they should be doing, regardless of what priest is there. Um, and if everything falls apart when you leave, then I
Yeah.
don't know how if I planted the right roots, right?
I know we've spoke about this in the past. So, like for you specifically, I think like you're a priest who is very relatable to a lot of young people and millennials, and you talk like us, you look like us, like you get us, and so I think a lot of people are. Speaking about you, are drawn are connected are getting more involved with the church, because of you in that relation, which is I think is a positive thing overall.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think it's difficult um, to go further than that? Where like if you do leave, for example, where like you're building that connection in the people with Christ directly.
I think obviously relationships are important, and of course it makes a difference what kind of priest you have or what kind of leaders you have, and of course you want good leaders, right? But that's only the beginning. That's not the end of the process, right? Like if the priest is good or relatable, or he's a good speaker, or he does nice sermons, or he has a nice voice, like all these are positives, but they can't be ends in themselves. That's what I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to say. So that's like the hook, that's the net, to catch the fish, right? Like it's like you have a good net, sure, but that can't be the end. Like that can't
No.
be that's just the process by which you introduce people to Christ. So if the priest uses his skills, which are given to him by God, they're not his, to bring people closer, great. But if he's bringing people closer to himself, right, this is a problem. And we have this tendency in Orthodoxy. Unfortunately, I find that we have, I don't know what it is. It exists in Greece, but it exists especially in the Western world as well. There is this strange tendency, maybe because it's also our culture, the pop culture. Like it's like we have hero worship, right? We
Yeah.
tend, not all people, but a bigger part, a greater part of the population tends to gravitate towards kind of guru mentality, right?
Yeah.
I
Right.
found this awesome priest. I found this awesome monk. I found this, and I understand people are trying to find an escape from the mundane, from the everyday, right? And when they find somebody who's authentic or somebody who's good and loving, they latch on. But the danger is that it becomes what we call in Greek prosopolatria, which is idolatry of the person, of the prosopon,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And then it just becomes another golden calf. It's not Christ, right? It's the
Yeah.
person. And so it's a fine line. Like, and I think a good priest needs to like know when to push, like when to kind of like grow, and also when to pull back. Like if he sees there's idolatry of himself, maybe he needs to come out of the spotlight for a while
Mm-hmm.
and let people go off and like explore other things.
Yeah.
Not other religions, I mean, but like, I mean, explore other parishes and let go of the
Yeah.
success or the numbers, right?
Yeah. No, I get that, and I would imagine like casting the net is the easy part, but like going that step further and getting people
Yes.
actually connect, that's I can see that being very difficult.
Hmm. It's more nuanced, right?
Yeah,
And it's like, and it's easy to say, "Oh, this is great. All these people are coming," right? And but deep down, there's a voice saying they're coming for me.
yeah,
So you
yeah,
have to temper that. You have to say, maybe it's time that I stop doing this, or I find a way to do it more indirectly, so that it's not about me, but it's you have to somehow find a way to push the spotlight back onto Christ. And that's been a hard lesson for myself, even like just to kind of how do you even do that, and how do
yeah.
you you know it's hard. It's hard.
I'd imagine so for sure. Okay, I was switching gears a little bit here. So,
Sure.
I don't know if it's always been like this or if it's because I'm just paying more attention in my adult life, but I feel like Canada and the policies and a lot of legislation that's we're seeing in our country is based on just ideologies rather than logic and what's best for
Mm-hmm.
the population and society as a whole. So I'm curious to just get, there's a few bills that I just want to run through and sort of get your perspective on them from like the, the church and spiritual point of view.
Sure.
On some policy. So first one, which I'm sure like Bill C-11, basically gives the government right, or could give the government right, to regulate speech online, which includes podcasts like we're on, and you have your own
Yeah.
podcast and things like that. And um, when you give a central authority like the government that type of authority, and compared to how society is very secular now, and like what you talk about as a priest might be controversial to some factions of society, including government. So how are you
Sure.
viewing this bill? Does that concern you for not only your work but like society as a whole? Like, what are your general thoughts on that?
So, talking about concepts, because usually Orthodox priests, some get political, and then I think that personally, like, at least for as a priest, when you're in the church and you're preaching, you shy away from politics. Why? Because you don't want to alienate your congregations. But this is a concept. Like, this is more of like this idea of, without talking about parties or whatever. Um, I think of course, it's concerning because from an Orthodox point of view, um, that our whole faith is based on the idea of freedom, right? Like, it's based on love, of course, the love of God, but also the idea of free will, right? So we're free to reject or accept the love of God, to accept or reject the concept of God, or the truth as God reveals it, right? And in a society, in a functioning society, which I think that Western society, everybody likes to bash Western society. Oh, it's secular, especially like a lot of Christians and Orthodox, like, oh, this is secular, non-Christian society. But the one positive that has been the constant up to this moment, that I think is also under attack, unfortunately, is this idea that in a pluralistic society, you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and you have this idea that you can respect other human beings even though you disagree with them, right? So this is something that has been at the cornerstone of a good functioning Western society and democratic society, right? Both in the United States and in Canada. More so in the United States because it's more ingrained in their constitution than it is in Canada.
Mhm.
Um, so I think these are really important concepts. Whether I agree or disagree with another human being, I should be allowed to express, right?
Yeah.
And so these types of laws that are being implemented now are dangerous because what they do is, it doesn't matter whether you're left or right or center, whether you're an atheist or religious, whatever, it attacks everybody's ability to express themselves. It attacks everybody's ability to think, because Jordan Peterson says this. It's like, in order to be able to think, you need to be able to risk offending others, right, and to be able to express openly, right, and
Hmm.
freely in a conversation, right. So now, when you start seeing like these types of things come in, you have like the thought police coming in, right, and it's like, well, if you don't toe certain party lines or certain or dominant views, or maybe even I don't even think they're dominant views. I think they're these type of extreme views of speech and offense and all these kind of things. They're actually a minority of people that believe these things, but they are the most vocal, and they're in positions of power, so they're impressing it on the rest of the population. I think this is very dangerous for us because
Yeah.
I will gladly accept somebody else saying things that I find completely abhorrent, um, in the pursuit of freedom of speech. That I am also able to speak the truth of the gospel, the truth of Christ. You know what I mean? And so once you stifle your enemy, or once you muzzle your enemy, you also muzzle yourself, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree with everything, obviously, and it's crazy to me how something so logical and basic has become political and partisan and crazy to me. But
Sure.
yeah, I agree with that. Next one here is this Bill 89. This is specific to Ontario. It's Supporting Children, Youth, and Families Act. So this
Mm-hmm.
basically governs child protection, among other things. So one of the amendments to this bill was that it now asks judges to take into account a child's gender identity and gender
Sure.
expression. And one part that's interesting in this bill is that, and I'm quoting it, religious faith, if any, in which the child is being raised, that has been removed as a matter to
Correct.
be considered when determining the best
Yeah,
interest of the
it was
children.
scrubbed from the bill completely.
Yeah, yeah.
So from the
So
previous legislation, it was
right,
scrubbed.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's no
Yeah.
longer there. So thoughts on that? Like, what do you?
It's problematic. It's problematic. Again, you don't have to be a Christian to find this problematic, right? I think any logical person would find this problematic because, again, it's like the previous legislation, because this was passed, this particular bill was passed like a few years ago. It was passed
Yeah,
actually when Kathleen Wynne was still premier,
I think
right?
2017, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah, and nobody noticed because our constituents, nobody paid attention. It was just quietly passed through the Ontario legislature, and I read this when it was being debated. I actually read the bill, and yeah, of course, the average person is not going to read it because it's going to take like 4 hours to go through, which it took me, and it's tedious, right? But
Yeah,
yeah, like one of the main things, and I tell this to parents, and they don't believe me, or and I'm talking about people who are not religious, they're just and people who are progressives or left leaning, and they're like, oh, this doesn't seem right. And I said, yeah, it's like basically the bill scrubbed, and the actual word religion was scrubbed from the bill completely, right? So there is no mention of it. Whereas in the past, yeah, like in the sections that deal with CFS, right, child family services, and in cases of abuse where a child needs to be taken out of the home and placed in foster care to mitigate stress on the child, right? You of course you would take into consideration their background, their cultural background, their religious background, all these kind of things, because it's very, very stressful for a child to be taken out of their home, even if it's an abusive home, and be placed with strangers. And so to have a child's religion not be taken into account, to be purposefully, dis, you know, uh, taken out of the equation, I think is crazy. It would create multiple problems. Like, so for example, if you have let's say a Muslim child that is removed from a Muslim household, for example,
yeah,
and then is placed in a Christian household, or placed in a Buddhist household,
yeah,
or placed in a Jewish household, that would probably be problematic for the child, right?
yeah,
And would place undue stress. So that is problematic. Of course, there's a political reason why religion has been taken out, because there's a push to kind of like sterilize, I guess you could say, legislation from the word religion. It's become the bad word. Um, and then of course, yeah, the injection of gender identity politics and things like that, um, you know, into kind of this legislation where, for example, it is considered child abuse um, to tell your child what gender they are, even if they're prepubescent, right?
hmm
And that if one was so inclined, let's say a teacher or somebody else, an adult, they could call CFS on your, if you have a little child who's like 5 years old or six
yeah,
years old, and thinks that they're the opposite sex, because children often play and don't understand these things, and they're still kind of growing and forming their sexual identity and their core personality. And if the parent says, well, no, you're not a girl, you're a boy, for example, if it's a boy, that could be construed under this current legislation as child abuse, because you're not affirming
yeah,
their gender identity, which is of course it's not even science right now. It's a political ideology, right? That has infected kind of like the public sphere. It has nothing to do with actual child psychology or medicine or anything like that. And then CFS could come in and take your child away for a period of 3 months.
yeah.
So these things are very scary, right?
Related to that one is Bill C4. Just going through the list here. So this is makes Bill C4. It makes conversion therapy of homosexuality and transgenderism illegal. So,
Mm-hmm.
in other words, Bill has very broad language, but you as a priest who holds very clear beliefs on like what gender and sex at birth is. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's
Sure.
scientific, but it would be illegal for you to counsel someone that is going through this
Mm-hmm.
or fighting this or explore or finding their
Sure.
personality. So that's another one that um,
Yeah. It's interesting that the legislation kind of like is very broad, and it has no nuance in it, right? So it's like, okay, look, you just conflated two different things, right? The actual legislation conflates, for example, let's say the issue of homosexuality, right, and transgenderism, and they lump it in all together as if they're two of the same phenomenon. They're not at all. They're two different things, regardless of what the Orthodox position is on it, right?
Yeah.
It's they're not the same thing. They're two different things, right? One is a sexual orientation. The other one could be considered a mental disorder, according to the DSM-5 right now,
Mm-hmm.
the gender dysphoria, which is a very controversial thing, right? So they're not the same thing, and the spiritual approach and the spiritual counseling would not be the same. Nor do the Orthodox even engage in what is called what's the word, conversion therapy and things like that. We
Yeah.
really don't have things like that. It's more of like an evangelical Protestant thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. You're right that anything that goes against kind of like this stated ideology, right? That you have to affirm whatever the person believes to be true as true would technically be illegal, right? And this
Yeah.
of course puts the church and all Orthodox Christians and all, I would say, all traditional Christians, period, and many other traditional religions at odds with the government and with the law,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just Christianity,
Yeah.
Islam teaches the same thing, and Judaism teaches the same thing, and yeah.
Have you experienced a time throughout your career as a priest where you felt religion like under attack in this way? Like, do you feel like it's under attack in any way?
I think that the struggle, listen, the struggle of the faith, of being a good Christian in the world is always the same, regardless of what generation you live in. It is true that in history is cyclical. We go through phases and it goes round and round and round, right? So the pendulum, from a secular point of view, swings from right to left, depending on the generation. And the church, if you look at the history of the church is always like, uh, you know, the rock, right? It doesn't move, right? It is the bastion
Yeah.
of truth. It doesn't change. So sometimes the church finds itself in some eras being favored by local governments because the society might be swinging to the right. And then there are eras where the society has swung far to the left and the church is at odds and also persecuted. Are we in an era where the pendulum has swung very far left? Yes, we are, of course. I don't think we're living in a right wing conservative society at all, where we're living in a very left wing society. Does it mean that that's not going to swing back the other way eventually? Of course it will, because history shows us that it always goes cyclical, right? Look at elections, right? Look at the political sphere, right? Where it's like, especially in the States, more so than in Canada, because in Canada we have like a different system, and a party can be in power much longer, right? But in the American system, where you have 48 years, presidency, right? Um, Usually, always the pendulum swings, right? It's like you'll have 8 years of a Democrat, 8 years of a conservative, 8 years of a
Yeah.
Democrat, with few exceptions, right? The society tends to swing, and this tension exists, right? Um, is the church under attack? Well, the church is always under attack. The church was under attack with them at the time of Christ. The church was under attack during the time of the apostles and the apostolic fathers. The church was even under attack even during the Byzantine Empire, where it's assumed that it was the Orthodox Christian Empire. You still had emperors who were decadent and who were secular and who were not really respectful of the church, right? Um, there's always something going on.
Yeah.
It doesn't change. It doesn't change what we are called to do. And what are we called to do? We are called to cultivate our own spirituality to the point where we can brave whatever comes our way with humility and with prayer, right? Sometimes we are called to stand up, sometimes we are called to protest, but other times we're also called to accept things as they are and just to quietly pray about it, right? Without being too pretentious and to being too overly vocal in the sense that to be like arrogant or to be hypocrites, right? Um, so I think that our calling is always just to be, in Greek we say staferi, to be stable in our faith, not to blow with the wind,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And not to be afraid even when things seem very, very scary, like now.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, for sure. One more, which I didn't know. I stumbled on this one recently, but
Hmm.
MAID, medical assistance in dying. Um,
Yeah,
it essentially allows anyone over the age of 18 to apply for MAID, literally as long as you have an OHIP card and you have
yeah,
suffering that is not deemed treatable to you, which
Yeah.
That's pretty much the criteria, and that's not even the most concerning thing. Starting next year, March 2023, mental illness will no longer be an exclusion for MAID, and like a lot of
Yes.
professionals and doctors and
Yeah.
experts, they're expecting the number of MAID patients, if you can call them, to skyrocket. Like how?
Yeah. So this is, it, the society that we live in, it's a so it's not even going to be conditions that are not treatable, because it's a subjective criteria, right?
Yeah,
It's unbearable suffering according to the patient, right?
right.
So, and who's going to tell you, right, that you're wrong? And so if I say, well, I'm sick, and even if there is a treatment, I'm suffering unbearably, and I want to take my own life. So basically, it's just basically the legalization of suicide, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, like, this is not surprising. Like, this is the movement, a society, generally speaking, when if you desacralize the beginnings and ends of life. This is something that my old professor, Father John Bear at St. Vladimir's, had said in a really good talk once. He said that the beginning and all of life is sacred, at least from an Orthodox point of view, right? And this is why every stage in life is accompanied by prayer and by like a sacramental kind of approach. So when a person, this, when you had your babies, your wife had her baby, it's like, I come to the house, and there's a blessing of the child for the first day and the eighth day, and then we have the 40-day blessing, and then we have baptism, and then you have marriage, and you have all these major stages of life all the way to death, right? And so for us, every stage of life is sacred. What happens is that in society, especially in Western culture, but you can see this even in like Western Europe as well, we have desacralized life, generally speaking. We've made it more secular, and especially the beginnings and ends of life. So if you notice, like, the beginning of life, right? So how do we desacralize that? How do we take away the sanctity, or the sacramental element of it? Well, it's like, we've made it commercialized. We've bypassed suffering for the woman, right? Mainly, so it's like, now it's like, because we have, C-sections on demand. We have, use of drugs, things like that, which of course are good in some instances, right? But you see, like, that slowly, you know obstetricians right now are performing more voluntary C-sections than they're performing natural births, right? The reason being is because people just kind of want to forego that whole process of birthing, right? And just kind of,
Yeah.
I'm going to plan, I want my baby on this day because it's convenient for me, right? There's no waiting. There's no humility and of course, I realize how misogynistic that sounds for a male to say this, right? For speaking on behalf of women, which of course I'm not. But this is females telling me this as well, right? So there's no waiting. There's no kind of like the surprise of what the gender is going to be. There's no, there's no kind of like, battle to bring a life into the world, right? Which we as Orthodox would say is important, right? There's just basically, okay, like, I'm going to go, I'm going to schedule my C-section, right? Very, very clean, very clinical. You go in, baby comes out 45 minutes, right? Of course, the recovery is hard, but it's very kind of like, and then people, hardly, a lot of Orthodox even don't even know about, like, the prayers that they should call the priest. It's just kind of like, it's kind of very secularized, right? In the
Hmm.
same way, at the end of life, we've also desacralized the end of life, right? So burial rituals are going by the wayside. A lot of, and I'm just speaking about Orthodox Christians, not even counting like everybody else, right? It's like, we don't need to do the church service anymore. We don't, just do a little prayer at the gravesite, one-stop shopping at the funeral homes. You know, we don't need to do the prayers, the 9-day prayers, the 3-day prayers, the 9-day prayers, the 40-day prayers, the memorials. Young people are not doing that for their family members anymore, or they don't even know the reason for it. They don't know how to, prepare koliva, like the boiled wheat that we have. All the basically the rituals that we have for
Yeah.
mourning. People don't know those things anymore. They don't care. People want to cremate because it's cheaper, and it's just like, just dispose of the body. So why do I bring all this up? I'm sorry for the long-winded
Yeah.
kind
No.
of response, but I think you can't answer these questions without understanding that, once you so my professor, Father John Bear, he says, it's like, when you desacralize the beginnings and ends of life, so you forget that we're coming from somewhere, from the divine, and that we're going somewhere at the end, right? Like, that when we leave this life, there is the eternal. When you get rid of that, all you have left is this life. And when you have when all you have is this life, then inevitably your life will descend into hedonism.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there's nothing else, then you better just have as much pleasure as possible. You better enjoy yourself as much as possible in this life, because when you're dead, you're dirt, you're done, right?
Yeah.
And so the focus becomes hedonism, hedonistic lifestyle, which is what the Western world is. It's all about pleasing every passion we have, every impulse, everything, right? Everything from Amazon delivering, same day or other day delivery, to Uber Eats, to DoorDash, to you name it. Everything is about satisfying whatever impulse and whatever craving we have as fast as possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, of course, if that is the outlook of what most people, or if that is the conditioning that we're receiving, right? And if my goal is pleasure, or to satisfy myself, or to have a happiness and joy all the time, then of course, as soon as that's not possible, why wouldn't I kill myself? Why
Yeah.
wouldn't I kill myself? Why? What benefit is there to suffering? I'm going to exit. Bye bye. Right.
Yeah.
And so this is a big problem. So
Yeah.
this is why you see increase in abortion, because we don't, obviously we don't value life, right? We value life only when we want it, right? So, when the baby's in the womb, we call it a baby when we want it. But when we don't
Right.
want it, we call it a fetus, right? It's a word game, right?
Right.
So, abortions are up. It's a form of birth control, unfortunately, right? We're just killing the babies. And then, of course, we kill ourselves at not even at the end of life anymore.
Yeah.
It's
Is the church against C sections?
no, not per se. No, no. The church is not. What I like about the Orthodox Church, as opposed to, for example, other churches, is that there are guiding principles, but there are not blanket prescriptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, oh, we're against C-sections. Well, no, that's dumb. Like, sometimes you got to do a C-section. Like, my wife had two because of medical issues, right? Like, it's no. But what the guiding principle is, though, is that, you know, you would try to birth naturally, right? For the experience, right,
Yeah.
of bringing a child into the world as naturally as possible, with least amount of, because a C-section is still a major surgery, right? There are more risks.
Oh yeah.
There are
Yeah.
more risks to your child and to the mother doing a C-section than there is naturally birthing, right? So, like, for example, when parents choose the C-section for no good reason except for convenience, you're actually putting your child and the mother's life into more peril, because you don't want to go through the pain of giving birth, whereas giving birth would have been safer. Now, we're not talking about medical situations where you have to do a C-section, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the guiding principle is, well, I'm doing a selfless act, right? I want to do the best for my child. So I'm going to try. So I'm not going to avoid suffering, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just convenient or it's easier.
Right.
And it has to do with courage. It has to do with integrity. It has to do with character. All these things that build us up, that make us, like, strong people, right?
Yeah.
And the more we avoid suffering, and we always take, like, the easiest way out, the less we cultivate that ability within us to deal with the real pressures of life. That's why depression is up, medications, all mental health problems. It's like a pandemic. Why is it a pandemic? Because nobody knows how to deal with normal pressures of life that our parents and grandparents were dealing with just fine for millennia.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
suddenly now we can't deal with life, even though we live in the most affluent, most richest time in the human history, where we have way more money and resources and everything, more than any other person ever in the history of mankind. And we are the saddest and most mentally ill. I don't. So how does that work, right? It's the antithesis of what you would expect.
Yeah. So like,
Right?
I didn't expect to go into that. But like, why is that? Like, why do you think that is?
Because we
Is it
lack the
the
tools to
Eden?
deal with adversity, right? You have to suffer in life. It's not like because we want to suffer, but you have to face adversity and overcome to build character within yourself, right?
So
And that's what.
when did these tools disappear then from our society? Because like you said, our parents were fine. Like depression and all these things weren't as prominent as
Yeah.
they are today. So like when did that disconnect happen where like people that weren't accessible to these tools anymore? Like
Well,
what
it's
happened?
not it's a gradual thing. It's not something that happens like a switch of a flick of a switch, right? But and there are multiple factors, right? So of course, one of the factors is spirituality, right? So authentic spirituality, which preaches, the bearing of one's cross, right? Taking responsibility. Again, this is why like Jordan Peterson, who's not even a Christian, why is he so popular? Because everything he's espousing, from a secular point of view, is extremely Christian, right? Bear your cross, pick up your damn
Yeah.
cross, trudge up the hill, make your bed, take responsibility, shoulder burden, right? The most burden you can, because it will build within you a strength and a character, and it will give you a satisfaction when you overcome, right? These are all the things that the generation before us and two generations before us, they did. They had world wars, they had famines, they had other pandemics, they had all these things, and they did not have the resources, the money, the food, the internet, these stupid things we carry around, these smartphones, whatever. They didn't have any of these things. They actually had to work for it, right? And so and they also had this kind of backbone of spirituality, the nuclear family. There was a matrix of things happening, which kind of supported, building character within people. And now, in the last, I would say maybe, especially in the last 30 years, I would say, right? You have the breakdown of many of these kind of like aspects of the matrix, right? So you have the breakdown of the nuclear family, right, in favor of no family. Of the family is even seen as a symbol of white privilege. You know what I mean? Like the nuclear family, right? So it's like you have single parenthood going up. You have the absence of father figures, which is a huge problem, right? And we can track this statistically, right? You have the education system going down. You have different political ideologies. You have the sexual revolution. You have the cheap and easy access to birth control, which separates the act of sex from the act of love, from the experience of love and family, right? It becomes something secularized, right, and weaponized and things like that. There is, the lack of religion, so that less people go to church, less people believe in God. So there's not a healthy fear of the divine, or a humility, right? Any of that, all these things, and of course,
Yeah.
the proliferation of technology, right? Easy access to information, easy access to everything, and also income has, right. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to this kind of like spiritual slash physical laziness that exists in our society today. Just here, because it's not everywhere in the world like this,
Yeah.
right? Um,
I
and
think that
and
I
and
would
we
also
don't, yeah.
I would also throw into that, like sort of what we were talking about, all these bills and stuff. I don't think there's ever been a time where government has been so um, involved in like our lives, and in terms of like what we can do in our homes, and like can't go
Hmm.
to church, and government is becoming so involved in our lives, like with these implementation of these bills, and in conjunction with media, and think in society in terms of like how we should behave or things we shouldn't do. And
We get who we elect, though, right? So it's not like the government came from another planet, right? It's We've elected these people, and we don't hold them to account as a people. Like we tend to see the government as this monolith. It's the other. It's like the bad government that's oppressing. It's like, yeah, but they're us. We are just people who are elected, right? So we complain about the government, and okay, we should, especially when they do things that are contrary to our basic freedoms, let alone our religious beliefs. But we're the ones who have elected them, right? And we put them in those positions. And when it comes time to oppose, we don't oppose, right?
yeah.
So, like you mentioned, for example, government getting involved. Look what happened with the lockdowns, right? It's like, okay, most people didn't like a lot of the aspects of the lockdowns, and wherever you stand on it, right? Again, right or left. Some people were pro, some people were against. But in the end, it's like most people who did not like, for example, certain measures, were also not going to stand up and say anything about it.
Yeah.
And why? Because we lack that fortitude. We lack that that courage, right? Because we've never had adversity in our lives, right?
Hmm.
The biggest
Yeah.
adversity is like, what am I going to wear in the morning or where am I going to go for dinner, right? It's like, so we don't have like this kind of like hunger or this zeal within us to stand up for certain rights, right? So, and then of course that allows people who are above us to kind of walk all over our rights and freedoms, right? So, because look what happened, like with the truckers, right? Big
Yeah.
controversial subject, right? The truckers is an example of an oddity within Canadian culture, because Canadians are very docile and very passive. And suddenly you had this group of people, massive group of people, who were supported by many, many more people from their homes, as far as like, moral support and financial support, right? Who actually went against, who bucked the system, right? And it was so strange for Canadian government to come, come face to face with this. Um, Again, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, I'm not going there, right? It's just, it was such a strange thing that what did the government do? They invoked the Emergencies
Yeah.
Act, which now there's the public inquiry starting today, actually
Yeah.
started yesterday, you know,
Yeah.
so they invoked something that is only done during wartime when there's like a terrorist plot or something. It's like the sovereignty of the country is like at stake for a protest in one city, in one municipality in the country, right? But it just goes to show you, it's like our politicians, they didn't know how to deal with this. They have no way of communicating, no way of having conversation, right? So we just crush it. We use dictatorial kind of like powers, because we don't know what else to do, because we've never seen this before,
Yeah.
right? It's a strain. So it just goes to show you, though, it's like, how docile are we? How ill equipped we are to
Yeah.
deal with conflict.
I agree. I like what you said about we've never people didn't stand up or lacked the fortitude to stand up because we lack adversity in our lives. And I think that quote that has been floating around for a while now, it was from an author, I can't remember his name, but hard times create strong men create good times, good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. I think
Yeah.
that's we're
Well, it's
living.
cyclical, right?
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
living
it's
in that
exactly.
weak men create hard times
Yeah.
moment right now.
And I think
Um,
that goes all the time, over and
yeah,
over again.
for sure. So speaking of the topic of children, like we're both fathers, of course. Your
Hmm.
kids are older, so you have more experience than I do. So seeing the world, like everything we talked about in this country we're living in, and just how seemingly opposed the society and the culture is compared to like our values. When I say our values, like Christian values or
Hmm.
religious views, like how do you think about instilling the right values to your kids and ensuring those values don't get corrupted by outside forces, which kind of seems very easy nowadays.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like how are you
Um,
thinking of that?
the only way to do it in a multicultural society is to walk the walk. And what do I mean by that? You can't cut corners as a parent. So, and what do I mean by that? I mean that, and one of the driving forces of what changed my life, at least about 4 years ago, when I had to kind of take stock of what I was doing, is that you can't be absent from your children's life. You can't preach something that you don't keep in your own life, because children, like, the parent is the first teacher, the parent is the first priest. And what do I mean by that? It's like religion. It's like, if you want your kid to be religious, you should be religious. And if you're not, your kids are not. So it's very simple. Children look up to their parents, for better or for worse, right? Even bad parents. That's why so many people are screwed up, right? So it's like, even children are always looking for the approval and love of their parents. This is the way we're built. So understanding that is that, and that's a great responsibility as well. Our children are always need that, and so whatever we give them and whatever we model for them is what. Not that they're going to be exactly like us, but that's the best. Like, you have the front row seat to their education, right? More so than the schools, more so than the government, more so than their friends. What happens in the home, and so anytime I see, like, when parents come to me, which they often do, and they complain about their kids, they say, "Oh, my kid doesn't go to church. My kid doesn't do this." It's like, well, do you? Well, I go now. It's like, yeah, you go now in your old age, because you
Yeah,
decided that in your old age, church was important, or maybe you got scared with something and you think, "Oh, I better put in my time for God." It's not how it works. It's like, so it's just, you can't cut corners. You can't. I see it like, I did camp. So I helped start the Orthodox summer camps in Canada 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now. Okay. And I was involved with it for about 20 years before I kind of stepped out of that. And what was the camp programs that we have, and now they started here in Toronto, Camp Metamorphosis, and now it's across the country. We have like 5 different camp
Yeah.
mets. It's a phenomenal program. It does so much good. But the heartbreaking thing of that program is that you bring these kids to camp, you take away their cell phones, we take away all the stuff. They're in the woods, they're in cabins, they're doing you know they're doing orthros like matins and vespers every night in English. They're reading these beautiful prayers, and they're learning how to pray, and they're doing confession, and they're whatever, they're in communion with nature and all these wonderful things, right? So they go for that week, and then by the end of the week, they're very enthused about the faith. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
we never knew all this stuff, and the priests are very accessible here, and they speak English to us, and this and that, and we're very, very excited, right? So the kids leave camp after a week, and we give them the services. They take the services home with them. They're these kind of abbreviated versions of the services in English. They can pray at home. And they get home, and more often than not, like 90% of all the kids, what happens when they get home? They get home and they're excited. They tell their parents about the experience. And they say, Mom and Dad, I'm going to go, you want to read Vespers with me? And the parents say no, because the parents don't care.
Hmm.
The parents think they're going to send their kids to camp so they can get their religion. The parents don't take any responsibility or ownership over the spirituality of their children. So the parents kill that spark. They smother it as soon as the kids get back home from camp. And then the kids get disillusioned. They say, "Well, I went there, and it was kind of like this Shangri-La of Orthodox life, and then I go back to the real world, and my parents don't want to take me to church. I can't hang out with my Orthodox friends. We don't pray at home. We don't. There's nothing sacred happening in the home. So that just kills it. And maybe the kid goes back again to camp next summer and gets another dose of it,
Yeah.
and that's good, but right.
No,
So the
no.
parents are killing, or the parent that drives up and drops the kid off at Sunday school on Sunday, and the parent goes off to Starbucks. It's insane, right? So we have these phenomenons more often than not. So the only way is you got to be involved in your kid's life. You gotta walk the walk. So if you want them to pray, you got to pray with them. If you want them to read the Bible, you got to read the Bible with them. If you want them to go to church, you got to go to church. If you want them to fast, you got to fast. If you want them to commune, you got to commune with them. You got to do all those things, and then they'll follow suit. And even then, it's not guaranteed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Even if you do all those things, and you've given them the best foundation, they could still reject it when they get older, and that's fine. Like, it's not fine, but you know what I mean, right? But at least you did your best. At least you didn't
Yeah.
handicap their spiritual growth. But that's the best, and you tell parents that, and they don't want to hear it.
It's it's like the most basic, simple advice, and but yeah, it's I feel like harder for a lot of parents to implement and take
Hmm.
action on. But yeah, I think that's solid advice. Something else I want to ask you about, which I think a lot of people, especially new generation, can relate, is about marriage. And I think the latest stat I read in like 40% of marriages in Canada will end up in divorce.
Hmm.
I think that's higher, but whatever, let's say 40%. So I think it's clear nowadays, and you alluded to it earlier, but more and more people are they're not getting married for the right reasons, and the sanctity of marriage is deteriorating amongst many other things. So what's your advice to married couples today, or those planning to get married?
That's a big one too. um, like, again, I can only speak from the Orthodox point of view, right? So it's a listen. You can't talk about these things in a vacuum, right? So this is a generational problem. Like, if if a couple, like all the couples that I marry, I don't want to say that I have a good track record on whether I know just from the meeting whether they're going to divorce or not. But the reality is, I do, and the signs are there, right? So, and you can't say that
Hmm.
because what if you're wrong, right? And you don't want to discourage them, but yeah, it's by the time you get to marriage, by the time you get to the point in your life where you want to commit to another human being, if you don't already have certain foundations from your family and your faith that are already in place and that have already formed you and your character, your personality, it doesn't matter who you marry because your presuppositions going into it are already incorrect, right? So I'll give you
Yeah.
an example again. It's like mixed marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're in a mixed marriage yourself, right? So, which is a very, very popular and very, very common thing because we're in a multicultural society. Okay, mixed marriages can work just fine, right? But it requires the couple, the people who are going to do it, let's say from two different religious backgrounds, like Catholic and Orthodox, let's say, right? Um, that you need to have some discussions beforehand, some honest discussions on, the big stuff, like not just forget about just finances and careers and things like that, but like just basic morality. It's like, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? How are we
Mm-hmm.
going to raise our children? What are our children going to be? How is that going to work? All these things have to be worked out before. And the problem is that people, because they often don't prioritize, they're not priorities for them. So a cradle Orthodox person who's born into the faith, or baptized as a young, no one's born into the faith, but you're baptized as an infant. If the person doesn't go to church, doesn't care about any of that stuff, and then okay, well, already your criteria of what kind of partner you want and what kind of person you're looking for is already tainted by a secular worldview as opposed to a religious worldview, right?
Yeah.
So, a young man, let's say, who goes to go find a bride, what is his criteria? Like, what is he attracted to? What is he looking for? If religion, like his faith, is not even part of the equation, then it ain't going to be, he's going to seek out a secular type of person. And then he's going to be upset when that person doesn't want to get married in his church or when that person doesn't want to baptize the kids. Like, what did you expect, right? Like myself, for example, when I was a young man, okay, I was religious. I was heavily involved in the church. So that obviously influenced, right, my dating when I got to the age of dating. Like I had not a lot of criteria, but I'm like, well, I'm not going to marry a non-Orthodox Christian. Why? Because I want to be a priest, and because that can't happen. So what's the point of even dating a person who's not Orthodox, where I know it can't go anywhere? So so I eliminate that problem right there, right? But even if I wasn't becoming a priest, right? It's like, okay, well, let's say I date somebody who's non-Orthodox, let's say a Catholic or a Protestant, right? Well, you know, I have to know that that's going to cause certain problems if that person is devout in their faith and we have different outlooks. So,
Yeah.
but I have to know these things when I'm starting to date people, not to think of it as an afterthought when we're already engaged now and we're trying to, back engineer the relationship to somehow shoehorn my spirituality into it. It doesn't
So,
work like that.
so no one has these like conversations early on, these like deep, like
No.
what are our values? How are we going to raise our kids? Like, is that like the core of it? There's like the lack of like upfront and communication and just deeper thinking.
Well, we lack the values. We lack the actual foundation because if our parents didn't raise us religious, then we're not going to be religious. And then we think that suddenly when we have this thought in our minds, not everybody, but a lot of people have this thought like I'm going to get married and then we're going to have this kind of beautiful nuclear family and we're going to go to church and we're going to baptize our kids. But people never thought it through, saying, well, I don't go to church now. Why would I go after I'm married?
Mm-hmm.
or I don't know anything about my faith right now, right? How is that going to translate into me raising my children Orthodox? It's not, because you can't give what you don't got.
Yeah,
So
for
this is
sure.
not a criticism. It's not like I'm
Yeah.
saying they're bad people. It's just it's like what we're talking about adversity. You're ill equipped to raise your children or the next generation when you don't have the tool set, the skill set or the tools to do it. So it's like any job. How
Yeah.
how can I teach my child to be a carpenter if I'm not a carpenter? Like, so how can I teach my child to be a fireman if I'm not a fireman? Like, or you know what I mean? Like, or how can I apprentice somebody if I'm not a master in that
YouTube.
field? Well,
Joking.
yeah,
No,
I
no,
know, I know what you're
you're
saying.
right.
But
No,
that's
no,
a symptom of the problem,
I'm
right?
just
Yeah,
joking. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
YouTube.
That's, yeah.
It's a problem.
So like you were born in Canada, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So do you think like are a lot of Greeks are like first generation here, like us? Like we were the first generation born in Canada. All our parents, like speaking of Greeks, like I feel like religion is just part of our culture. Like you grow up,
Hmm.
Greek is like attached to being Greek is like being Greek Orthodox. You know, it's like one of those things. The next generation, like our kids, not saying your kids, because like I guess it's different for you, like being a priest, but like me, for example, like other first generation Greeks. Do you think there's just going to be a huge like drop off in like the religion and people who attend church and like by generation or?
It's going to be, it's hard to say because we don't have numbers, because we don't, the church, unfortunately, the Orthodox Church, at least here in Canada, we don't poll our people, and we don't dig into the numbers. So like, we don't have any information, right? We I think we're afraid to have information. So what do I mean by that? It's like we have no idea what our current numbers of faithful are. So we have numbers like how many people get baptized at every parish every year, right? Because we send paperwork into the archdiocese, and they log everything in the registry department. So we know how many weddings and how many baptisms and how many deaths, all that kind of stuff, right? But that doesn't tell you anything. That just tells you who's Orthodox on paper.
Yeah.
So, but what you really want to do is you want to drill down into the numbers of out of, so I'll do, like here in this parish, I do like 60 baptisms, let's say a year on average. That's a lot. I do about
Mhm.
a 60 funerals as well. So it's, so people are like, oh, that's great. Well, you're replenishing, right? Like 60 are going, 60 are coming. Not really, because of the 60 families, how many of them go to church?
Yeah.
They may have baptized their kid, but if the kid doesn't show up and the family doesn't show up, effectively, they're not Orthodox. They're Orthodox on paper. Okay, the door is open, but effectively they're gone, right? They're living secular
Mhm.
lives. So if that's the case, oh, how many of them? So out of the 60, I would say maybe three.
Hmm.
So and my bar is really low. I'm like, that's like come to church once a month, which is
Yeah.
not good, but it's something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So um so if it's only three out of 60, you do the math, right? So we need to have like a census or some kind of study to see what is the percentage of the annual baptisms of people who are actually involved. Same thing with weddings. And then you get your real numbers. And then that would scare the crap out of everybody, because then we would realize that we're much smaller than we think we are. We're not doing as well as we think we are.
Yeah.
Um, the pool is much smaller as far as active Orthodox Christians. And then you start asking the question, well, then you can kind of like not predict, but you can kind of extrapolate what the next generation is going to be like, right? Um, yeah, I think it's going to go down before it goes up again, or
Mm-hmm.
it's going to, or the emphasis is going to shift to maybe converts,
Mm-hmm.
to those who are non-Greeks who are coming into the faith, who are more zealous, and then they start having kids, and then they start promoting. So the culture will change.
Yeah.
Um, so that might happen. In the States, it's happened. The States are like fourth generation. They've gone through these growing pains, right?
Yeah, I was gonna,
Um,
gonna ask you about, isn't the states like a good like I feel case study, I guess, on what happens when you're a few generations deep.
it's a case study. I don't know if it's a good case study because we're not the same country as the United States, right? There are different factors here. So the United States, they made a decision very early on that they would prioritize their orthodoxy over their Greekness, over their Greek culture, and to their benefit, because a lot of them don't even speak Greek anymore, but they're
Yeah.
Orthodox, and their churches are growing, and they have very strong churches and organized. Whereas in Canada, we're still first generation. We have an identity crisis here. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know if we're a cultural club, or if we're preaching the
Mm-hmm.
gospel.
Yeah.
And so until we figure that out, we're going to keep losing people. We're not going to be very evangelical in the sense that we're not going to be reaching out to local communities and bringing Canadians in who need to be baptized. Um, and that's going to hamper our growth as well, and even our sustainability, because Greeks are not going to keep having kids, and like you see, like, and mixed families, mixed marriages, they're not fully Greek anymore. So it's not about being Greek; it's about being Orthodox, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's going to dilute even more and more, which is fine. This is part of going to a new country. So if you don't put emphasis on the religious aspect, on the preaching of the gospel, you're going to lose. If you think it's a cultural club, that's going to die. If
Yeah.
that's the model you're going to take. So we don't know what's going to happen in Canada, because in Canada it's a different beast, right? Different political climate. Americans tend to be more community driven. They like all Americans. It's like part of the American culture where they're much more connected to their local parishes, the local communities, whether they be Orthodox or
Mm-hmm.
Protestant or whatever. They tend to be more generous to their not with their time and their money to their local communities. Canadians are not.
Hmm.
Canadians are more passive, and Canadians, ironically, are more secular.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
who
So
knows what's going to
fundamental
happen?
differences. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
So who knows what's going to happen in the future? I hope we do the best we can, right? We plant the seeds, and
Yeah.
who knows?
Um, we're well over an hour, but there's one last topic or question here. So,
Hmm.
um, living in again growing secular society, as we said, a society that's becoming overly sensitive, to say the least. With that being said, there's a lot of uh, controversial passages in the Bible that many people, whether they're religious or not, would find controversial nowadays. And a lot of agnostic people, especially, will say, how can you believe in the Bible when it says this or that about women and gays, etc. So how do you view and interpret some of those controversial passages, and like what's your response to that type of commentary?
Well, it's there again. So the Bible, it's the moral Christian morality, right? As far as like the morality that is laid out in the Bible is it's clear and it's unchanging, right? And the Orthodox Church doesn't change towards that. Um, the application of that morality, as far as how you enforce that, I don't even like the word enforcing because the Orthodox Church does not see itself as an enforcer of anything, nor as a punisher of anything, right? The Orthodox Church's job is to, as we said before, it's to facilitate the salvation of the individual, and it's a medicinal, it's a therapeutic approach. This is how confession is. Like so, confession, for example, between let's say Orthodox and Catholics, the Catholics take a very punitive approach, a legalistic approach, right? It's like you sin, you are offending God, right? It's like you have a debt to pay, and you're going to go and you can confess, and then you have to do penance, right, to pay it off. Hence,
Mm-hmm.
why they have purgatory and things like that. In the Orthodox Church, we don't have that. In the Orthodox Church, confession has nothing to do with punishment, has nothing to do with making a person feel guilty. They already feel the guilt. That's why they're going to confession. The confession is more like a likened to going to a doctor's office and giving your symptoms, and the priest is more like the doctor, the spiritual doctor, who is taking in the symptomatology and then diagnosing the problem and then giving the proper medication so that the person can be healed, made whole. So there's no punishment there. It's more like, okay, let's look at some certain spiritual exercises to make you be able to overcome, right? So I bring this up because the application of morality, whether we disagree or agree with anything in modern society, there's lots of things that we disagree with, right? And of course, we take a very hard stance in the sense of what is marriage between man and a woman, right? Um, what is Christian morality on homosexuality and things like that? It's like we do not consider them to be correct, right? But the application of it, like so, for example, it's like, well, does that mean though that we vilify and we go after and we oppress and individuals who are dealing with these problems? No, we do not. Right? We are all part of the body of Christ, or at least baptized Orthodox Christians, and the approach would be medicinal. The approach would be to help heal the person and to integrate as much as we can without compromising our morality. Right? So it's very nuanced, right? And it's very complex, and usually these kind of ethical and moral issues are dealt with between the individual and their spiritual father, right?
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to monolithic kind of like blanket statements about everything. Like, will we ever have gay marriage in the church? No, we would never have that, right? Because we consider, marriage to be between a man and a female, and it's a sacrament, right? It's a sacrament. It's not a political statement, nor is it just like
Yeah.
a civil contract, right? And there are varying reasons why that is the case, right? It's not just because the Bible says so, and we don't have time to get into all that, but that doesn't mean though that the church also cannot show compassion and love and understanding to people who are struggling with different aspects, right? I think the big problem with society right now is that we have hyper sexualized everything,
Mm-hmm.
and we have hyper focused on certain issues over other issues. So the
True. Yeah.
big hot ticket items are transgenderism, right? Gender studies. Homosexuality is not even an issue that's even talked about anymore because we've moved on to more kind of radical extremes, right? Where homosexuality right now is considered, it seems relatively normal, and conservative compared to the other things that we're seeing right now, right? Um, but the church would say it's like, well, why are you hyper focusing on just these issues, right? The church would say, well, the human being is like on this big spectrum of like human experience, right? And we have a plethora of different human experiences, and sin, which is missing the mark, right? Missing like the goal, which is to be Christ-like, right? Is on this massive spectrum, right? We're not all the same, and we all falter on different on different ways, multiple different ways, right? And for us, all of it's bad. All of it is like anytime you miss the mark, you're missing the mark. It doesn't matter what it is, right? And everybody is worthy of God's love, and everybody's worthy of acceptance as a human being in the image of Christ, right? And everybody is worthy of compassion, right? So it's not just that one thing. Like, what about all the other sins that we commit, right?
Yeah.
What about all like, am I better am I better as a sinner with my personal sins? Are my sins less sinful than, let's say, a homosexual's or a transgender? Like, why? Why are my sins any less?
Yeah.
My sins are just as bad, right?
Yeah.
So we're all in need of healing, right? That's the approach. It's like that we don't pick out this is really bad, this is really bad, or this is no. It's all it falls short of the
Yeah.
glory of God, right? This is the Orthodox approach, the mentality, right? As opposed to just like singling out people, whatever. You know, it's just
Yeah.
we don't like labeling people. We don't like, and we don't like identifying people with the sin. That's a problem. So once you start using the word, like the actual sin, as an identity, that's a problem in a society.
Yeah.
And forget about the hot issues. Like, for example, if somebody commits murder, right? Well, from an Orthodox point of view, right, we shouldn't call them a murderer.
Mm.
You
Right.
are the image of God. You are a human being. You committed the horrible act of murder, committed the sin, right? But you do not personify murder. Like, once you start calling the person by their sin, it becomes part of their identity.
Right.
Yes, I'm a murderer. That's all I am. Yes, I'm a thief. All I do is steal. No, no, you are the image of God. You are
Yeah.
loved by God. And even if you make these horrible mistakes, you can repent, you can change, you can restore what you are, right? So this is the problem. It's like that there's certain hot topics in society, and they've appropriated the language, and they've identified, I am this, I am this, I embody this, as opposed to saying, I struggle with these things, but it's just a part of me. It's not the thing that makes me who I am,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Makes sense. Bring up again the topic of you like you mentioned these hot keywords now, a lot of like hyper focus on like gender and sexualization, all this. And I know we talked about religion being under attack, which has always been the case throughout history. But um, do you think that sexualizing young kids, which is happening now in schools and in media and like these bills that we're talking about, like would you say that's I would say that's a pretty easy way to attack the core nucleus of and a core family value, where you can put things like that into a young impressionable kid early on, and just get them to start thinking in ways that they probably shouldn't be thinking at these age, and it sort of like attacks the core family.
Yeah, obviously, if you want to change society's way of thinking about an issue, you attack and you begin to re-educate the young, right? Because if you plant the seeds from the way young, it's going to be normalized when they get older. This is why you have such emphases in early childhood curricula, right? About a lot of different issues, right? To kind of re-educate and to kind of to train up a new generation thinking in a new way. And of course, this is problematic when the things that are being taught are considered to be highly immoral and also highly, you know, not even scientific, anyways. But that's another story altogether. And again, but this comes back to the parents, right? You got to watch what's being taught in your school. You have to keep an eye like a hawk, and you need to make sure that as your children grow, because of course they're gonna, there's different age appropriate things you can discuss, right? Um, but you need to be on the ball as a parent and to educate your kids. And I'll give you a practical example from my family, right? It's like my daughter is in now she's grade 5, right? She's 10 years old. But like when she was in grade 3, right? So almost 3 years ago, her teacher tells her, this 25-year-old teacher who's just out of teachers college, tells her that men can give birth.
Really?
Right? Tells her grade 3. So my daughter comes home and is confused how men can give birth. And now I am placed in the situation as a parent. I am forced now to not only explain, because she's old enough to understand, right? But it's still too early. But she's old enough though to kind of understand the concept. But now I'm forced into a position where I have to explain to her that the teacher's wrong because a biological male can. Now I understand what the teacher's trying to impose on my child. The teacher's trying to say that a biological woman who transitioned to be a man but still has a uterus, right? But this is confusing the children. Children don't understand this, right? And it's going to mess up their understanding of sexuality, right? So now I have to basically, preemptively, do sex ed with my kid, and it's better that it's me doing it than them, right?
Of
So
course.
I have to sit there and explain to her now how birth works. And of course, okay, I found age appropriate material to deal with, right? And not too graphic and things like that. And there's ways to do it, but you have to go to a certain degree into detail because she doesn't understand why a man can't give birth. And you have to explain what a uterus is, and you have to explain, what sperm is and all this kind of stuff, which you don't want to have a conversation with your grade 3 child who's
Yeah.
8 years old, right?
Yeah.
Or 7 years old. But you have to now, so that you can explain, so they can understand why it's nonsense what's being taught to them, and that they can distinguish and they can use this discernment to know when they're being lied to. So the parent has to kind of deal with this now and not just brush it off and say, oh, the teacher's wrong. But the teacher's in a position of power and authority over the child, where the child looks up to the teacher. So it's like, what do you mean, Daddy, that the teacher's wrong? Are they wrong about everything? It's like, well, no, they're not wrong about everything, but check in with me when something doesn't feel right,
Yeah, for sure.
right? So this is hard. You have to,
That's
like, you're
scary.
forced
Yeah.
in these situations. Yeah. But you have to do it
And
though.
even scarier is if your kid doesn't tell you about that, and they just
Hmm.
they don't
They just take it at
communicate
face
that with
value.
you, and they just take it, and that's just sort of what they go along thinking that, and you as a parent don't
But
even
this is
know
why,
that was.
yeah. But
Yeah.
this is why you have to be active, even like in parent-teacher interviews or
Mm.
curriculum nights, where if you hear nothing, you should start asking some questions. It's like,
Yeah.
what do you like? Can I have a copy of the curriculum for this year? Can I have a copy, please, of what you're teaching? What are the topics you're teaching for sex ed this year? Just so I know as a parent, right? And they have to provide it to you, right? So
Yeah.
you can, like, so you can know what the heck's going on. And a lot of parents, because they're busy, or they neglect their children, neglect their education, and I get it, they're tired, they're running around, whatever. But these things slip under the radar, and then the
Yeah.
kid
I
is in
mean,
high school, and it's too late. They've already been indoctrinated, right?
yeah. And everyone's busy, everyone's got things going on, but at least for me personally, and I think for most people should share this, is like kids take precedent over everything, like top
Correct.
priority. So make
Mhm.
the time.
It's the next generation, right? You
Yeah.
have to train them properly, right?
Yeah. Uh, um,
Sacrifice other things.
yeah, you have to for sure. Father Ted, appreciate it. We were an hour and 20 minutes here. We could definitely keep going, but I'm sure you got things to do,
Sure.
and so do I. But appreciate it. Always very insightful chatting with you, as always. So
It was a pleasure, Costa. Anytime. It's always nice to kind of just talk about a plethora of issues. Yeah, anytime.
yeah, hopefully I didn't get too deep on certain things, but we should do this again sometime.
Whenever you want. I'm always available.
All right, sounds good. All right, talk to you soon. Thanks again.
Take care.